European Parliament has just passed a draft of the AI Act, which they say would be the first comprehensive global legislation on AI. Welcome back to the AI Breakdown. On Wednesday, June 14th, the European Parliament advanced a draft of the AI Act, which could become the first comprehensive global legislation when it comes to AI. Today, we're looking at what the Act includes, what the response is among industry and other advocacy groups, and what the precedent could mean for other regulation around the world. The first thing to know is that while the generative AI hype has been around for the last 7 months or so, of course, since the launch of ChatGPT in November, the EU has been working on this AI Act since April 2021. That was when the European Commission first proposed the EU regulatory framework and started working on what would become a slate of something like 43 technical meetings, 12 political meetings, to come up with this draft, which has 85 different provisions. The European Parliament website says Parliament's priority is to make sure that AI systems used in the EU are safe, transparent, traceable, non-discriminatory, and environmentally friendly. AI systems should be overseen by people rather than by automation to prevent harmful outcomes. Now, the approach overall of the AI Act is to have different rules for different risk levels. The categories that they include are those systems that have what they consider unacceptable risk and should be banned, systems that have high risk and so require a different level of consideration, those with limited risk that need a lighter touch, and then a separate set of considerations for generative AI all on its own. Now, a lot of the discussion so far has been on the things that fall in that category of unacceptable risk. The EU includes in this real-time and remote biometric identification systems such as facial recognition, social scoring, which means classifying people based on behavior, socioeconomic status, or personal characteristics, and cognitive behavioral manipulation of people or specific vulnerable groups, an example being voice-activated toys that encourage dangerous behavior in children. Now, in terms of this draft law specifically, there are a few of those technologies that are directly banned. One of those, for example, is live facial recognition. And even though the European Parliament has voted to ban the use of live facial recognition, there are still discussions that could change that in practice over the next bureaucratic steps around whether there should be exemptions for national security or law enforcement. Another activity that is banned is companies scraping biometric data from social media to build out databases. Now, one of the areas that's contentious has to do with transparency requirements around generative AI. Some of the provisions in this bill would include companies having to publish summaries of the copyrighted material that they use for training their systems, which publishers support because they think it means there could be a path to revenue. Obviously, right now we're dealing with lawsuits in the UK and the US from Getty Images around Stability AI's supposed use of their private database of images to train their Stable Diffusion model. AI developers, meanwhile, have said that this is technologically infeasible and also could create another set of problems that the European Union isn't anticipating. This is obviously a different approach than we're seeing in some other places. Japan has been seeming to indicate that they will not enforce copyright when it comes to model training as a way to increase Japanese competitiveness when it comes to AI. Now, there are some other parts of the generative AI slate of rules that are a little bit more agreed upon or consensus among many people across industry and policymaker sets. Those include things like working to design the models so that they prohibit the generation of illegal content, as well as AI-generated content disclosure so that people know that they're actually interacting with content that was created by AI, not humans as we normally think about it. Now, when it comes to the high-risk activities, a recent research paper called To Be High Risk or Not to Be defined the risk conditions across 5 concepts that includes domain, such as law enforcement, administration of justice, or critical infrastructure; purpose, in other words, what the AI is meant to do; its capabilities natively from a technology perspective; who the AI user is; and who the subject of the AI is. For example, one thing that has been determined to be very high risk and thus prohibited in the AI Act is law enforcement using AI tools to predict future criminal behavior, Minority Report style. So you can see here the domain is law enforcement, the purpose of the AI is predicting the occurrence or reoccurrence of criminal offense, the AI capacity is profiling, the user is the law enforcement authority, and the subject is the perpetrator or suspect. Other uses, however, while in the same domain, may still be high risk, but not high risk enough to ban. So, for example, law enforcement using AI tools to investigate criminal offenses, such as evaluating the reliability of evidence. That's still high risk, but not so high risk to ban. Instead, it just requires a different type of regime. The European Parliament writes, AI systems that negatively affect safety or fundamental rights will be considered high risk and will be divided into 2 categories. 1, AI systems that are used in products falling under the EU's product safety legislation, including toys, aviation, cars, medical devices, and lifts. And 2, AI systems falling into 8 specific areas that will have to be registered in an EU database. Those include biometric identification and categorization of natural persons, management and operation of critical infrastructure, education and vocational training, employment, worker management, and access to self-employment, access to and enjoyment of essential private services and public services and benefits, law enforcement, migration, asylum and border control management, and assistance in legal interpretation and application of the law. So this is what the EU means when it says that they're taking a risk-based approach. These are riskier activities, so they have more rules around them. Law enforcement won't just have freewheeling access to AI. AI systems that relate to it have to be registered in an EU database and will likely have a different set of disclosure regimes and review processes as well. Now, in addition to just registering these high-risk activities, the EU is also looking towards a set of pre-deployment risk assessment processes that effectively create some formal go-no-go process before advanced or high-risk models enter the public domain. This isn't so far from something that Sam Altman said in front of Congress, that when it comes to advanced models, it makes sense to potentially have a regime for, if not research, for approving when a sufficiently advanced model can actually be released to the public. Sam Altman and OpenAI haven't commented on this version of the EU bill that was just passed, but did get in a little hot water last month when they said that the regulations might be hard to comply with and might be a case of overregulation. Indeed, Altman said that OpenAI might not be able to comply and would actually have to leave, causing quite a dust-up with European politicians before walking it back and saying that OpenAI had no intent to abandon the European Union. Now, at this stage, there still haven't been many comprehensive reactions to it. Amjad Masad, the CEO of Replit, did say it's heartening to see that the latest draft of the EU AI Act has a carve-out for open source, and much of it is limiting government usage of AI, such as prohibiting Chinese-style social scoring. I'm starting to think that these legislators are largely reasonable. Hot take. However, as Jeremy Howard pointed out, that's not all open source models, and there is a carve-out from that carve-out for open source foundation models. And Gennaro points out that part of what we're seeing with this AI Act in terms of its shortcomings has to do with how much of it was formalized before the rise of generative AI. Gennaro writes, "This is the proposal of the AI Act which was formalized in 2021, which is why it's so skewed towards government risks with a couple of adaptations for generative AI. We'll need to see the legislation they'll do on top of it to have a final call on whether it's good or not." Gennaro specifically points to those issues of documenting all of the copyrighted materials from which a model was trained. He argues copyright should be tackled in court, i.e. companies suing OpenAI, not via legislation. And here I guess no foundation model would pass the test. He concludes that's why it's critical always to go beyond the rhetoric of the legislator, where you hear all nice words in 2 hours of discussion, and at the last minute when discussing practical application, you stumble upon the real pitfalls it can cause.
Our rules are on 3 levels. First, so if the rules will be enforced today, what ChatGPT will need to do is, number one, mind the interests of those downstream of the value chain to make sure that they pass on the information they need for them to comply if they go into high-risk areas. Number two, they'll have to be transparent about the data sets that they used in training ChatGPT, how ChatGPT functions, the basic parameters of the system. And number three, and most importantly, the 2 specific things for generative AI, for example, for ChatGPT, i.e. they would have to show that they have, in the course of developing and designing their algorithm, they have seriously considered the lawfulness of the content that might be produced. Now, I have a question mark if they did ask that question when they developed. And number two, they would have to reveal all of the copyrighted material that they use in the training of the algorithm. They have to document it. We say comprehensively document and be transparent about it. This is what ChatGPT will have to do tomorrow if the legislation will come into force. Thank you.
I agree with Gennaro that this could be an extremely problematic provision of this bill. I don't think it would be very beneficial to anyone if all of a sudden, overnight, every LLM and chatbot was brought into non-compliance because of these rules. Frankly, the gambit there for Europe is that every other country in the world would make similar rules, and so those companies wouldn't have the ability to just abandon Europe because they found those rules too onerous. I think that at this stage, it's far more likely that Europe would effectively just be banning its citizens from ChatGPT, while ChatGPT went off and thrived elsewhere. Now, the good news is that there is still a lot of bureaucratic process before this draft bill is finalized. And more than that, the recent crypto legislation passed by Europe, the Markets in Crypto Assets Framework, or MiCA, went through something similar, where a lot of this was drafted in the ICO era and so deals with things like initial coin offerings, even though they're not really a thing anymore, and figured out how to punt until MiCA 2 on some really thorny issues of NFTs and DeFi and other more recent advancements. Now, Europe does have an interest in getting rules on the books as relates to generative AI. I don't think they're going to punt that entirely. However, I also don't think it would necessarily be all that difficult to come to some common sense agreements about the things that everyone can agree on, and say more difficult and complex issues such as copyright for a future session. Ultimately, this is a big deal. It's a big step in the first comprehensive AI legislation. Even if it's not copied entirely, it will set precedent for other nations. And the question you have to think for EU citizens is the extent to which this makes Europe a leader in AI versus just a leader in AI regulation. Of course, if it just makes them a leader in AI regulation, but without the benefits that AI can bring to society, to work, and beyond, it might have a very unintended set of consequences. Obviously, we will continue to monitor it closely, but for now, that is it for today's AI Breakdown. If you're enjoying, please like, subscribe, and share. Check out the podcast and the newsletter version of this. And until next time, peace.